So it all dates back to when I was, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 years old. And I was sitting next to my mom at a cafe, I think. And of course, I didn't know how to write because I was only like 3 years old. So I was scribbling on a piece of paper. And my mother asked me if I was writing. And I said, no, I'm writing numbers.
Welcome to another episode of ArrayCast. My name is Connor, and today we have a special guest. But before we get to introducing him, we will go around with quick introductions. First, we'll go to Bob, and then we'll go to Rich.
I'm Bob Therriault. I'm a J enthusiast and involved with putting together the J Wiki right now, which is keeping me very busy. And I've been doing J for about 20 years now.
I'm Rich Park. I'm an APL evangelist and educator working for Dyalog Limited.
And my name's Connor, as mentioned off the top of the episode. I'm your host for today, not a professional APL, JK, BQN, or any other array language developer. I program in C++ day-to-day, but all of those languages I absolutely love, and I have a blast recording these episodes. So we've got 3 short announcements, I think 2 from Bob, 1 from Rich, and then I will introduce our guest for today.
Okay, well, I'll start off. I've got 2 things that are going on currently with J. One is, last week, Eric introduced an add-on for ArrayFire. So there is now ArrayFire on J, and you can start to run it on GPUs, right in test phases right now. So it kind of had a lumpy start, but it seems to be running. I've run it through and stuff. I'm not doing a lot of the high speed stuff that you might need to do. And ArrayFire is an application which actually can allow your computer to run computations from the GPU. So that's what it is, and they've just introduced that in J, which is pretty exciting because it's sort of adds up things to parallelization, a lot of other things as well. And the other thing that just started to happen yesterday, and I think sort of happened as a result of one of my JWiki group reports, was there's talking about putting dictionaries in J, which is really fascinating because right now, literally right now, they're trying to figure out what a dictionary in J would be. And they're looking at K, they're looking at Q, they're looking at a whole bunch of different models, but they're actually talking about doing this. Eric came on yesterday and said, yeah, we've been thinking about this for a long time, but we need to figure out how we would do it and whether we would do it. So it might be out next December when the next beta is released. And completely ready to go, but it's kind of exciting to watch this sort of stuff happen, which is it's really neat.
Well, so in less technical but more community-oriented news, there is, well, I guess when this is released, there'll be a few days left for you to be able to vote on a shortlist for a potential new APL logo. So historically, individual companies, these vendors who produce APL products, APL interpreters have used their own logos, but there hasn't really been one universal logo for the APL language itself. So the community has set up a page on the APL wiki, which there will be a link to in the show notes, and you can go there and find out how to cast your vote. So that closes on that closes on the 10th of February.
Awesome. So we got GPUs, we got dictionaries, which I assume means hash maps or some implementation like that, and also logos. So links for all of that. Or Bob, do you want to add something too?
Well, I was going to say that's the big question with dictionaries. Right now, I think they've pretty much settled on a dictionary as something with key values and a value to a pair of things. But past that, in J, what does that mean, and how can you develop it in a way that's actually beneficial? And so that's what's being discussed right now. Now, I should say, and I sort of mentioned it off the bat, this does not mean this is going to happen. It just means it's in discussion now, which is very cool.
Interesting. I wonder if there are dictionaries that aren't hash-based. I would consider it, if it's not going to be hash-based, I'd consider it calling it something different, because I think in Python, they call their hash maps dictionaries, and that being one of the most popular languages in the world would probably confuse a few, or I guess maybe it wouldn't confuse the J folks because they would all just know. But
plus maybe it's largely to do with the interface, right, that the J user is going to interact with, how they're actually going to create these things. maybe even more so than the underlying implementation.
Right.
I think there has been a decision not to try, and that came up, Python, because that's one of the languages that, I think that's how it all started off the JWiki. We were talking about different languages and their approaches to bringing people on. And Python came up, and then people's dictionaries, and the decision was made not to try and be Python. That's not an approach that is likely to happen, but we'll see.
Yeah, stay tuned. I'm sure we'll hear more in the future. With that all being said, though, let me introduce our guest for today. So I'll start off by mispronouncing his name. His name is Rodrigo Girão Serrão, and I'll give him an opportunity to completely recorrect my pronunciation. But Rodrigo is potentially, you might know him from a number of things. He operates sort of in multiple different worlds, the APL world and the Python world. So in the APL world, he is a coworker of Rich's at Dyalog Limited. So I believe that makes you the fourth or fifth guest on that we've had from Dyalog Limited. So soon we're going to have the full roster on, I'm sure in 5 or 10 years. And so, yes, an evangelist of APL, sort of content creator, has given talks on both APL and Python. I believe he has a book called Pydon'ts, and has given a talk at multiple different Python conferences. I think EuroPython and DjangoCon. You can correct me if that's incorrect. And has also given APL talks at sort of APL conferences. I think most recently you spoke at the Dyalog 2021 conference, and has spoken at previous webinars and conferences before. Also has a YouTube channel and a blog. We'll add links to those in the show notes for you to check it out. So is constantly producing content that you can consume, and has lots of interesting views on sort of bridging the world between mathematics and programming languages and different programming languages like Python and APL. So that's what I'll say about Rodrigo. I'll throw it over to him to give, so he can give his own introduction of himself and add anything that I've missed.
Thanks, Connor. I won't be judgmental of your pronunciation of my name if you guys don't judge me too much by my English. Oftentimes I butcher some words, so that's fine. In Portuguese, my name is said or is pronounced Rodrigo Girão Serrão. But for all of you that don't speak Portuguese, Rodrigo is fine. You can call me whatever you want, just don't be offensive. As for an introduction, thank you. That was actually quite a flattering introduction. I'm very excited to be here, and it's quite kind of interesting to see you, as I'm used to listening to you and to transcribing the episodes. So actually having the faces talk at the same time is an interesting experience. But yeah, as about myself, I don't think there's too much I have to add. I just think it's important to say that I've always been fascinated by mathematics as long as I can remember, and that explains a pretty big part of my journey. And at some point, as I was entering my teens, I got interested in programming as well, and I just picked it up because it was a nice way to help me solve maths problems, and that's pretty much how I've gotten into the world of programming. It's mostly because of that and because of my interest in problem solving. And yeah, I just hope that this turns out to be a nice conversation.
Awesome. Yeah. So maybe you want to tell us a bit more. So you were interested in mathematics, as was I, and I'm sure a ton of array language folks, and then stepped into the world of programming. So maybe tell us a little bit more of your path from stepping into programming in your teens, and then to here you are now on an array language podcast, and you're working for an array language company. Not many folks, I think, take that path because it's the array language world's a pretty niche world. How did you end up taking an interest in APL and array languages?
Well, I will try to not make it too long. So it all dates back to when I was, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 years old, and I was sitting next to my mom at a cafe, I think. And of course I didn't know how to write because I was only like 3 years old. So I was scribbling on a piece of paper, and my mother asked me if I was writing, and I said, no, I'm writing numbers. So I wasn't writing my name or anything. I said I was. Of course I wasn't, but well, I said I was. And so my interest in mathematics started early. I'm not trying to say I was like very clever. I'm just saying I was interested in it. And I was always very curious, I think. And this sounds kind of cliche, but it is true. So I was very curious. And when I was 12 or 13, I asked my father what a website was. And my father told me it was a text file in a server. And this didn't make any sense to me because the only text files I knew were Word documents. And I had no idea what a server was. And so I started Googling and I found out about HTML. And so that's how I first dove into the world of programming. And then I picked up a bunch of different languages. I picked up JavaScript and Visual Basic and C. And eventually a colleague of mine in high school suggested I started learning Python. And so I did, because I was curious and I loved learning bits and pieces of new languages. And for some reason, Python clicked in the sense that even though I kept exploring other languages, I always kept coming back to Python to do all sorts of small hobby projects I decided to do. So that's why I've been writing Python code for so long. For example, combinatorics was never my strong suit, but combinatorics is all about counting things, right? So I could write Python programs that create all of those objects, and then the program just counts them for me, so I could check my answers to combinatorics problems with Python. So that was always one of the reasons why I've kept programming around. And then as for APL and the array languages, in the beginning of 2020, I started, do you all know CodeGolf, the CodeGolf website? Okay, so I started posting problems over there, and people would answer the CodeGolf challenges in all sorts of crazy languages. And I started seeing people answering in APL. And I thought, because of the context, it looked like APL was an esoteric language, like created with the sole purpose of solving CodeGolf challenges. But then I found out about the APL Orchard, and I met Adam over the internet. And so I started learning APL. Adam taught me over at the APL Orchard. And at some point, Adam asked if I wouldn't be interested in interning with Dyalog. So I sent my CV to them, and they were interested. And so I did a summer internship working on mastering Dyalog APL. And I guess they liked my work because they said that they'd be interested in keeping me when I was done with my master's thesis. And so when I did finish my master's thesis, I joined Dyalog and have been working with them ever since. It's been a 1-year-long relationship by now.
Yeah, so it actually feels a bit longer.
You're already tired of me.
Still haven't finished that. Still hasn't finished that damn book.
Yeah, it's a long book.
It is. It's a big job, though. You're turning it into an ebook, and it was published originally 2009. So Rodrigo's also updating a lot of the sections for language enhancements and other stuff, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, creating new chapters and whatnot.
So what does I guess I'm sure there's a bunch of listeners that are hearing about mastering Dyalog APL for the first time. Does one of you, Rich or Rodrigo, want to give a high-level short overview of what it is, what it covers up to currently, and what the goal is with the future version or edition? I'm not sure what it's being called. 2.0?
I guess we're calling it a rework. Can we just say MedAPL because it's faster? So MedAPL, which is short for Mastering Dyalog APL, is a book that was published in 2009 and was written with the purpose of serving as a APL tutorial, and it's like 800 pages long. It's a huge book, and it covers like all of the language and then some other relevant tools like charting tools and databases and whatnot. But this was 15 years ago, and in the world of technology, 15 years is a long time. So plenty of new things were added to APL. And so what I'm doing is I'm taking the old book, which is it's a paper book you can buy, but it's also available for free as a PDF. And what I'm doing is I'm going over the book, rewriting it. What's pretty much everything I'm writing, I'm keeping it the same, maybe just updating some examples, but then I'm adding the new things, and I'm trying to figure out what goes where in terms of keeping it a cohesive book that teaches APL. But it's just a matter of really updating things, maybe removing some examples that are outdated because now new primitives solve that specific thing. But yeah, the purpose is to have you can actually go to mastering.dialog.com, and you have the web version of the rework. So you can see how far I've come by going to that website and checking the rework there.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to the reworked version. I've used the PDF version as a resource, But yeah, definitely it doesn't cover anything in the last decade, of which if you go to the APL wiki page for features and things that have been added with the new versions, I mean, what version was Dyalog APL?
12.0.
12.0, yeah. Now we're up to 18 point something, right? Soon to be 19.0.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a lot of language versions, and it wasn't only like one or two things that went into each version. There's a lot of stuff. So, and I think most of the tacit stuff, of course, which we've talked a lot about on this podcast, isn't in the 12.0 version, I don't think.
You're right.
All right. So skipping back, what prompted you to add your own problems? You just were curious to see how people would solve these in different languages, and you knew about it from somewhere?
I'm not entirely... I honestly don't remember. I had stumbled on the website a couple of years earlier, and I did create an account, but I never went there. And then for some reason I stumbled upon it, and I don't know, I guess my nature just propelled me to start posting challenges because it's something I like to do. I don't know. And I realized it was a community filled with people that actually love solving challenges. So creating a challenge for a bunch of people that enjoy solving it is very rewarding. And so I started posting there. I don't remember why. I just did.
Okay. And so you start posting these, you see APL solutions, and then you find yourself on APL Orchard after, looking into APL a little bit. Yeah. What was that like? I mean, most people, we've talked about this countless times on this podcast. They see APL and they're just like, oh, this is a crazy language. And then they just either run away or they ignore it. They don't usually walk towards it. So what piqued your interest, I guess?
So the first thing that sparked interest was just seeing APL code because of all the glyphs. That was very new to me, because even though I guess we could say I had written code in many different languages, but they were all very similar, right? Using English keywords and whatnot. So APL and some of the other languages that you can find on CodeGolf, they strike me as very different because they tend to use different symbols. And APL especially because the glyphs, the Unicode symbols that they use, not all of them, or most of them are not letters. Like letters of the Latin alphabet. And on CodeGolf, most of the esoteric languages make use of those 26 letters plus all sorts of accents on top of them. So it looks different.
Like ASCII, right?
Yeah, not only ASCII, because there's not enough characters in there.
But a lot of the golfing languages are like that, right?
Yeah, but some of them also use like letters and accents, and it looks more different, but it still looks familiar to me, especially because in Portuguese we have plenty of accents in letters. So, but APL looked very different, and because I'm inherently curious, I thought, well, let's try to learn a little bit of this. And then Adam just... It's not Adam's fault, but Adam just wouldn't let go, and it looked very interesting. And what do you call it? I feel there's a very high affinity that APL has with mathematics, and because I'm also very into the world of mathematics, I guess it just made sense to keep learning because it looked very interesting and it felt familiar in a sense, because the things I was learning, they were immediately relevant when I was playing around with mathematics. And I guess that it hooked me because I just kept on learning more.
Interesting. So it sounds like basically curiosity, which is exactly what we talked about. I think, was it last episode? Collecting curious people with Aaron, and then also a predisposition towards mathematics are the two things that kind of hooked you in.
For me, yeah.
And so how do you go, or maybe at that point you already sort of had entered, because now you've got your blog, you've got your YouTube channel, and you are trying to sort of create content that you know, it says on your blog, sort of bridges the world between math and programming, and you're not just giving talks about APL, you're also giving talks, and the book that you've written is on Python. Do you want to talk a bit about sort of your strategy there of, having a foot in two different worlds or multiple different worlds, and how that influences the content that you create?
Well, calling it a strategy, I think, is too far-fetched, because I don't think there's like I'm not being strategic in having Python content and APL content. It's just that what's interesting is that, or what maybe we could talk about, and sorry to maybe redirect you, is the way that I feel APL has influenced my Python code. Because I was already fairly, let's say, fluent in Python when I started learning APL. And learning APL meant I was learning a whole new paradigm, right? Because array-oriented programming was essentially new to me, even though I had seen Numpy. And so learning APL and learning the array-oriented paradigm actually influenced my Python code. And I think that's something that's quite interesting. And it goes back to this quote I keep quoting or citing, or whenever I get the chance, which is that a language that's, gosh, I keep forgetting it as well. What was it?
A language that doesn't change the way you think is not worth learning?
Yes, thank you.
By Alan Perlis, yeah.
Yeah.
Every APL programmer picks that up at some point. I think it's at the beginning of the structure and interpretation of computer programs as well, which is a very famous textbook that has nothing to do with APL, although it mentions APL several times in footnotes and stuff like that.
Rodrigo, can I ask you about, so you did the YouTube series of videos on learning APL with neural nets.
Yep.
So neural networks, you implemented that. Was that pretty early on in you learning APL and seriously trying to do APL stuff?
Yeah, it was.
And you mentioned Numpy before. Have you done a similar thing like in Python or using Python frameworks as well?
Yes, I have. Yeah.
Because there is a thing that comes up in discussions of array languages versus other ones, and or conventional languages that either have array semantics, or like Numpy, it's a package designed to kind of do array processing within Python, and it's this idea that somehow you can take the specific parts that people perceive as useful from the array languages and just inject them into the other ones. But did you find there's actually some other difference when you actually went to use APL versus, a similar experience in Python? I don't know if you used Numpy, but... Yeah,
no, I did use Numpy. From my limit, so everything I say, of course, is tempered by my own experience and my own views and whatnot. But from my limited experience, it's almost insulting to say that you can take whatever from APL and just put it into Numpy and that you get you can get good things from APL and you can put them in Numpy, but it's not the same thing. Writing Python code with Numpy is definitely not the same thing as writing APL. For the particular example of the neural networks, I used Numpy because at the core of the neural networks, you have just a bit of linear algebra, some matrix multiplications and whatnot. And so using Numpy for that makes a lot of sense, because I don't want to be creating my own matrices from scratch and implementing matrix multiplication and whatever. But doing neural networks, so the matrix multiplications, obviously I'm going to do them with Numpy, but then everything else, the whole architecture and everything else will be Python. You have some for loops and some if statements and some functions and some classes and whatever. With APL, I'm doing everything in an array-oriented way. So obviously, matrix multiplication is still matrix multiplication, but everything else is done, let's quote unquote, in the APL way. And so it's very different, right? There's just a tiny subset that looks very similar because it's matrix multiplication and vector addition and linear algebra, but then everything else looks very, very different.
Rodrigo, does it make a difference if you're doing APL style thinking with the machine learning and AI and that kind of stuff? Does it change the way that you do it compared to how you would do it in Python? I know they would look different, but does it change your perception?
It does. I don't think I don't have to be writing machine learning related Python code to be influenced by my APL experience. Something as simple as what's called a list comprehension in Python, the way I write those was very influenced by the fact that APL has scalar functions. And the fact that you can combine, I don't know, adding two vectors in APL, you just add them. But in Python, first, you don't really have vectors, you have lists. And the typical way, or what a beginner would definitely do, is use a for loop to go over both lists at the same time and then add them. And list comprehensions turn this upside down, and instead of having the for loop in a highlighted position and then the addition or whatever operation you want to do, list comprehensions put the transformation you're doing at the front. And the ceremony related to the for loop, they put it on the right. It's not so highlighted. So the transformation, which is what's important, right? It's what matters is that you're adding things. It gets highlighted. The transformation gets highlighted. And I only understood that this was what list comprehensions were doing. So I only understood that list comprehensions were nice. This was the major advantage of a list comprehension because I use APL, and because in APL I essentially only do the data transformation, for example, and just things like being more comfortable with doing what I've heard people call like data-driven conditionals and using booleans to implicitly but also kind of explicitly change the results you're computing. I got that from APL because in APL booleans are just zeros and ones, and it's very natural to, I don't know, sum a vector of booleans, right? And so it makes a world of a difference to know array-oriented programming when you're writing Python code and probably any other language.
So I would guess part of it is once you have that understanding, once you realize that, and you go into adjust what you've done or make a change to what you've done, you're making that change in a completely different level of understanding because you're focusing on a different part of the program to make the change.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like you have a whole new understanding. I've written list comprehensions way before knowing APL, and only now, because of APL, I can definitely say list comprehensions are nice because the data transformation is under the spotlight. And this only clicked because of APL.
I've been wrestling with this recently because I have the exact same thing that APL functional languages in general, they completely change the way I write code in other languages. And just the other day, because Wordle is it's the fun thing it's the fad of the whatever. Not sure if it'll be the year. New York Times just bought Wordle, so I think we can all say rip to our streaks. And as soon as my streak is gone, because humble brag, I've never lost, so I have like a whatever n out of n. And as soon as that is gone, I'm done with Wordle. It's like I'm not sure if everyone in this call will know about Snapchat streaks, but it's like as soon as you lose your Snapchat streak of like 100, it's like, do you really want to start over? It's like, no, not really. So if New York Times, if you're listening, because we know we probably have the whole staff of the New York Times listening, you better keep my streak alive. And if you put some behind some paywall and reset it to 0, I'm done. But anyways, not the point. Went on a tangent there. Is that I was recently writing a Python script to do some like Wordle analysis. And at first I wrote something that was like a nested for loop, over the words in the dictionary and the letters in the words or something like that. But then very quickly, using exactly what Rodrigo was saying, list comprehensions. And honestly, I think that like list comprehensions, generator expressions combined with destructuring or iterable unpacking, I think is what they more commonly call it in Python, and zip, like you can get so far with just like list comprehensions, zip, and iterable unpacking, and enumerate as well. Zip and enumerate, I just use all over the place. Yeah. And at first, when I wrote the first piece of Python code, I was like, nested for loops, they suck. But then very quickly, I was like, oh yeah, this doesn't need to be a for loop. I can change that to a list comprehension, and then I can change that one to a list. And at the end, I was using counter as well, which is a collection that sort of mimics group by. And you need to know all the little things. You need to know a zip and enumerate and the counter collection and how to use list comprehensions. But at the end of it, I was like, this is actually quite nice code. Like, It started off awful, but because I know functional techniques and like array techniques, it ended up really nice. And I was thinking to myself, like, this was actually quite pleasant. Like, you know, I'm not very sad that I'm in Python right now. Like, it's a bit irregular, like the fact that, you know, zip and enumerate are built in, and list comprehensions are part of the language, and then I have to reach for collections and know that counter is there to get the group by stuff, whereas in APL or in other languages, it's all a lot more regular. But anyways, I've been wrestling with, like, this idea of, like, do I really need a full-blown array language, or do I just need a nice language that has all these facilities and that I know how to use them? And like, there's a bunch of different quotes that I've heard. You know, there's the imperative shell functional core of, like, try to design the core of your programs functionally, but like obviously you need a bunch of IO on the outside. So like, if you've ever tried to write that game of, like, the guessing game of, you know, you randomly choose a number and then did you guess too high or guess too low? And then you just go back and forth. Like, writing that game in any language, it's like 80% just like reading and parsing input and then printing stuff to the screen. Like, it ends up looking terrible in any sort of functional or like array language, because you're just using like flow control and like a while loop until the answer's guessed correctly. And I also heard another quote recently that was that Elixir was like a functional language for the working person, in that it's got all the functional, you know, things that you'd want, except for algebraic data types, I think, which is sad. Should add that Elixir. But it's also gives you the ability to do all the things that you might want to do in terms of IO and you know, Python and these scripting languages. And so you can very easily do that kind of functional core imperative shell. And I feel like maybe I haven't coded enough in APL, but like that's lacking there. Or like we do have the flow control sort of if and whatnot. But anyways, that was just like a long-winded, incoherent ramble of, you know, what is like the ideal language? Like, and it just came from like coding in Python and at first being unhappy because I wasn't in APL, and then realizing at the end after sort of refactoring the code that it was like, this is actually quite nice. Like, most Python programmers aren't going to program like this, but like I made myself happy because the language offered a lot of the stuff. And it's like, should we be trying to get people to come to languages where that sort of behavior is encouraged more? Or should we just be doing, you know, Python talks like Rodrigo and trying to influence the Python community that, hey, you can code in this method that's nicer? I'm not sure if folks have thoughts, or I don't even really have an opinion. It's just an incoherent, like I said, long-winded ramble. Bob?
Yeah, I don't think so much in terms of individual languages. I think it's paradigms, because I think if I was lucky enough when I did my university training, I had a comparative languages course, and in that course, I think I did PL1, which dates me, and Lisp, which was at that point the original Lisp, and APL. And those are three very different paradigms for programming. And at that time, this again dates me back on batch processing with computers which was PL1, compared to interpretive languages like Lisp and APL. And it radically changes the way you look at programming. Just the difference between compiling a language and waiting for it to come back and finding out that it compiled okay and then it was optimized and then you get your result, as compared to typing in something on the screen and getting a result back in a REPL. And at that time, Lisp and APL, I think, were the two that were predominant that were doing REPLs. I guess I'm trying to think. There was probably a couple of others that were like Snowball and a few others that were maybe using that modeling stuff, Simula maybe. But it was very different from what people were traditionally being taught in computing languages. But when you start looking the more nuanced as opposed to interpreted compared to compile, you get the different ways of looking at data, different ways of looking at functions. Functional programming starts to show up, which again is a different approach. Object-oriented with Smalltalk and things that show up, that's a different approach. I think you end up taking a little bit from all the different paradigms. Now, which language you use in a paradigm, I don't think is as important as being exposed to that different way of looking at the whole process. Because I think the different way of looking at the process really does change the way you look at the overall thing. And at that point, when you've got sort of a sense of the different paradigms, the different languages just becomes syntactic details. You do it this way because this is how they interpret it. But the overall look at it, I think, is more to do with the paradigm.
Do you have thoughts, Rodrigo?
Yeah, I think I was in the back of my mind. I was thinking about what Connor said, and now I think it plays nicely with what Bob said, because I also wrote a bit of code to solve Wordle, and I started out by I didn't do it in Python first. I started by playing around with it in APL, and you can do imperative programming in APL, but it favors APL favors array-oriented programming a lot. So I obviously started by writing some array-oriented code, to filter some words, and then I have these clues, so these letters can be here and whatnot. And well, I played around a bit and I figured out, okay, so this is the kind of code I need if I want to, I don't know, take a list of clues, take a list of words, and figure out which words could be the next ones. And then I put that away, and then I opened Python, and I started doing the same thing, because I was essentially, I was challenged by someone on Twitter from the Python community. And so I thought it made sense to present a Python program. But my initial thinking and my initial train of thought was done in APL, because I could very clearly see in my head the matrix of words that they all have the same length. So why wouldn't I stack them up in a matrix? And then I knew I was filtering by columns and whatnot. So it made a lot of sense. So I played around with it in APL. And when I had it figured out, I just wrote the Python shell around the APL core. And of course, I didn't write APL code in Python, but I did what you just mentioned. I used counter, I used generator expressions, I used zip, I used enumerate, like literally those tools. And it's just a fact of having the right mindset, because if I hadn't known APL, and from your description, maybe you too, I would have written maybe a double nested for loop or a triple nested for loop or whatever, and I would be done with it.
This is a story that we hear quite a lot with recent adopters of APL, is when it comes to actually solving a problem, they'll think about it in this way from what they've learned, but then at some point they're going to translate it into some other language, sort of just for the utility that other people speak it already,
Yeah, that's what it happens.
Or for other reasons. This idea of array languages is good for prototyping and exploration and things like that. Comes up quite a lot.
Yeah, it's interesting too, like what role does the Google ability of the language play? Because like I actually did think about writing this little Wordle solving script in APL, but I knew down the road what I wanted. So what my script does is you provide it two lists, basically the list of your guesses, and then the list of the 5 character strings where a Y represents a yellow, green represents green. And I guess now that we're like, this is half of a Wordle episode, should we explain what Wordle is to our listener? It's basically a mastermind game. Hopefully you're familiar with that game, but if not, you guess a 5 character word. So, for instance, tears, Tears, and you're going to have 6 guesses in total. And the goal is to guess the target word, which you don't know, and say that your target word is tally, Tally. Because you guessed tears, T is in the correct position and A is in the wrong position. So your T will be lit up green and your A will be lit up yellow. And then, so with that information, you can make your next guess. So next guess might be, I don't know, what's a good off the top of Talon, like Talon, Talon of a falcon. And so then you'd get T, A, and L all lit up green with the O and the N as just nothing. And so from there, you make another guess at so on and so forth.
And the other key thing is when it isn't lit up, that letter is not in your end word. So you're not just being told where it is and if it's somewhere in the word, but if a letter doesn't show up, you know not to use that letter again, which is I thought was kind of interesting. When my wife plays with it, I don't.
Yeah, it's addicting for sure. Especially I love Scrabble, and so it's a Scrabble adjacent kind of game. But so the one thing about Wordle is that it doesn't use a full list of 5-letter words. So in the Scrabble dictionary, there's like 8,900, 30-something 5-letter words, but the list that they use is only roughly 2,500 long. And so when I initially wrote my script, I happened to have a Scrabble dictionary text file on my computer. So I just sort of used that as the basis. But then a couple people, because I tweet about it, a couple people were like, it's not the Scrabble dictionary. You can get the Wordle list online. And so my program, basically, you give it the list of your words and the list of your guesses, and then, the yellow and green status. And then it will show you, based on, after your first guess, how many words are there left that you could possibly guess. So, after your first guess, mine is usually a rose, AROSE, there'll be like 400 or 500 possible guesses. And then after your next guess, I think yesterday's was... so we won't be spoiling, although this will be out, a few days. But in case if you guys are playing it and you haven't done it yet, yesterday's, so it's already done, was rung. Is that right? No, it wasn't. It was one that didn't have any. Well, we'll just assume who plays it. Does anyone play it here? What was yesterday's? I can't remember.
I'm beginning to see why your streak is still intact.
It's anyways. There was one where a rose missed on every single letter, and then the word was light, LIGHT. And so I guessed a rose. It was a complete whiff. So then my next guess was until. And then, so I think after the first guess, there was 300 left. And after until, there was 30 words that you could possibly guess. And then I guessed filth. And then after that, there was only one word, which was light or something like that. But the thing is it underneath the number of guesses that it shows you a number, it gives you a sort of what a really good guess would be based on some sort of some random metric. It's something really simple that I came up with. But it chooses that from all of the Scrabble words. And what I wanted eventually was to color code it so that it would show up in my terminal as green if it was a valid Wordle word, and then red if it was only in the Scrabble dictionary. And so this long-winded explanation is all to say that I thought about... at the end of the day, this is what I really wanted. I knew I could get to the halfway mark before the colors, and tabulating something would actually have been pretty simple. Loading two dictionaries in, checking whether they exist in one or the other. That's brilliant for APL. But then as soon as I need to color code the words, I don't even know where to begin. And I know in Python, even though I don't really know where to begin either, I've done something like that in the past, and quickly Googling how to change the color of something in the terminal, you get 3 different options, all of which are just, a pip install something, and you're off to the races. And this brings me back to my original question after a 10-minute ramble of, what is the importance of the Googleability of a language? Because I basically chose Python because I knew that I could get to my endpoint, quite easily without a lot of extra effort to learn how to change the color of something on the screen. Whereas for APL, I don't even know if I probably couldn't do it in the terminal. I'd have to figure out some way to launch some sort of panel, like JPanel color box thing. And I've seen Aaron Shu do it on some of his talks where he just he has this little graphics, GFX, and then boom, everything's changing colors. But he does it so quickly, I have no idea what he's doing. Anyways, I'm not sure if folks have thoughts on...
We'll ask him to make a little tutorial.
Yeah.
There is also a terminal-based GUI thing, but I can't recommend you use it. But back in the day, people were making little terminal-based graphical interfaces, and you can do it there. The default display for some application that comes with Dyalog has some really awful color scheme. So I'm also around. I'm saying, yeah, these things are possible, but you're absolutely right. The Googleability makes that super appealing.
So you get to a certain point, is it it's influenced the way I write APL, but then I still didn't choose APL because I knew that there was some extra 20% that I would be a little bit too hard for me to figure out, and I just screw it. I can do this in Python. Rodrigo, you're going to say something?
Yeah, but I'm not sure if I'm just clinging too much to this specific example, but I think that this wasn't really a matter of, or maybe I'm misunderstanding what the Googleability of the language means, but this doesn't feel like an issue with being hard to Google about the language. It's just that you were missing that final tool to do the terminal colored stuff, right? Because in Python, you would do maybe pip install reach, which is a tool I've been using a lot lately to do actually highlighting, like you've mentioned, and it's just, you don't have that already in APL. So probably no one built a reach for APL, and you would have to look at maybe under the hood of Reach and realize, okay, this is just using NZ escape sequences, and you would have to do it in APL yourself. I think it's just the fact that maybe not many people share their tools.
Well, my guess is that, if we were playing the Aaron game and he was here, like if we challenged him to do this, he could, like, I guarantee you, sure, you might not be able to do it in a terminal, but it's not actually like a terminal-based thing was not what I was necessarily after. It was just like a color-coded, whether it was a pop-up window or some sort of graphics panel or something, or if it was inline in the RIDE editor, all of the above work. It was just sort of like the coloring of text based on some sort of, information. And my guess is that APL definitely you can do that. The question is like, what is the barrier to like me figuring that out? And I can't Google it, which means I need to either go, like, my best guess, probably what I would do is I would try and go find like a webinar talk, because I know that there's been a bunch of webinar talks from past Dyalog conferences with people talking about graphics and plotting and stuff like that, and like that would be where I would go to try and find that info, because I don't think Googling would work, and even going to like the APL wiki or trying to find like a tutorial, like I think that'd be very, very hard. If it exists, like I'm not even sure if that tutorial exists. I could be wrong, but yeah, Bob.
Yeah, this sort of strikes on two things for me. One is the approach we're trying to take to the JWiki eventually is to provide those kind of access to those kind of tools. So that's a huge job. It's not going to be done in months or probably even a short number of years. But the idea would be that you would have access to those tools through that, and you'd get a either tutorial or some kind of a framework that you could look at. What the bigger issue, I think, is, and it was striking me partly because we're having Rodrigo on as a guest, was there's a generational thing that happens with the array languages. There's an older generation that often started things out, and for some reason there's a middle generation that is kind of missing, I think. And at the time when other languages were coming on and developing these other tools, that wasn't happening with the array languages. They were sort of going off on their own merry way, doing their mathematics, doing their financial, their fintech stuff. All that stuff's happening, but not the media, not the web, not all that other stuff that the other languages were making use of. And now what I can see happening is you've got an older generation that isn't versed in those things, wasn't developing those tools, and a younger generation coming in, and there is one coming in, which I think is tremendously exciting, being one of the graybeards, literally. You see another generation coming in, and the good news is they're coming in and they're interested in this because it is a different way of looking at things. The challenge is they come in and they look at it and go, but how do I do the graphics? What do you mean I have to? This is nuts. Why would I have to do all this work? I can do all these other things with these other languages. And often with Python, what's mentioned is the libraries. You can do any number of things with Python libraries. That's a big advantage of Python. Where those libraries are, there are a lot of libraries with the array languages as well, but they're not in the areas that would be popular with most programmers today. And I'd love to get a sense from you guys, since I think you're at least trending towards the younger generation, whether you see that difference. Again, when I say generations, I'm generalizing.
Look at that. Those subtle shots fired there.
I mean, well, I do have to mention, I got to mention something I've been looking into sort of recently as well. And I don't know, hope I don't get shot or fired for saying this, but when you look at the, Dyalog's more mature tools for graphical interfaces and also graphics plotting and stuff, they're both, Dyalog came along a lot for Windows desktop applications and moving things which used to live on mainframes onto modern desktop computers. Or were they? How long's it been since desktop computers turned up? But a thing called Quad WC is sort of a really rich interface to WinForms and Win32 GUI and stuff. So if you want to build that, there's actually about a third of that Mastering Dyalog APL book from 2009. The last third of that is all about creating GUIs on Windows. But as Bob mentioned, it's kind of the rest of the world has said, well, we're going to use WebStack, I guess. That's why we do GUI now. So, we're working on figuring out exactly what the Dyalog story is going to be for that. There's the DUI, Dyalog User Interface. They used to be My Server, or My Server still exists, but, there are things that are looking into that. But the other thing I wanted to mention is our plotting and sort of reports stuff, something called Sharpleaf and Sharpplot. I don't know if you've heard of those, but they're also touted. They're really quite mature, really rich packages, but they were sort of designed around print media, right? Actually publishing printed reports and books, so they're really geared for that. So yeah, it's a little bit of an open question. It is a lot of what Bob said, where APL kind of, the array languages lived in their own world while the Python and that lot were developing these packages to collaborate, and maybe a little bit for the Googleability, a bit of a chicken and egg problem where by now there's enough users to generate all of these Stack Overflow answers for those more popular languages, and it's just now going to take a bit of time before you can just Google how do I make colorful words in Dyalog?
Yep.
And get a decent answer.
Maybe I should do a live stream where I actually attempt to do this and watch. It'll be over in 20 minutes because I'll find something. But yeah, it's an interesting. It's interesting because I'm a huge array language fan, and I was like, honestly, I could do when I first was like, oh, it'd be cool to have a little sort of. It's a teaching tool. It's I say hacking Wordle, but really it's in hindsight how good were my guesses. And was this a good guess? Did it narrow it down to only 3 or whatever? And it's I knew I could do 80% of it in a language like APL, but I ended up choosing Python, because I knew I could do 100%, even though I, didn't fully know. I knew a couple Googles and I'd be on my way. And then at the end of it, I wasn't even that sad. Actually the coloring code is pretty horrific. And that probably I should. That's the thing, is I listen to a Python podcast and they're always talking about rich and textual. So I probably should have made use of that, but I made use of some library called Term Color and just it's a bunch of print statements all over the place inside a loop. It's pretty bad. But that's the thing, is I don't even know if you could do it in APL. Yeah, I guess it would just be some multiply, have some mask that's just a 1 for red and a 0 for green, and maybe it would be as easy as that.
It came up in the Orchard, I think, last week or something. People were talking about, introductory examples for people who are new to programming, and some of the most appealing things are these graphical things, especially making games or websites, which I think is also where I started, like Rodrigo. You see these websites, you're like, oh, how do I do that? And then you learn it's not that hard, really. Up to a point. Well, back in 2000 and whatever.
Yeah, you could think of a couple really cool, building a Tetris in APL. That's a perfect kind of game because.
Yeah, but so Adam kind of objected at the time because he was like, well, the problem I find is that the part with the user interaction, the user input is just so much boilerplate gets in the way of the problem you're trying to solve. And it's you were saying, Connor, 80% of what you were doing that you thought you could have done in APL is the actual problem you're trying to solve. It's the extra 20% was all this sort of gubbins around it to make it a nice, the shell to make it presentable and sort of user friendly and bits like this. But I do think that is something that would be useful to have in array language examples, is an easier way to get into those things where, I don't know, there's a lot of power to the feedback, both of making something that you can then play with afterwards, but then also something that you can show other non-technical people and they do know the sort of value of what you're showing them, without it being oh, you did that in 3 lines of code, or good for you, mate. I don't know, it's a gibberish to me, but when they can play with a game, or they can see a graphical thing happening on the screen, you can show that off as a young kid learning programming and go, oh, look at this cool thing I did. And your parents can go, oh, yeah, that is actually quite nice. without going, oh yeah, okay, I don't know what that means. But
yeah, there's definitely some value to having like
I think there's something to
a
that.
flashy example. And a lot of time flashy examples come with flashiness in the...
But it's true, and I think most of the languages, yeah, the code for that bit looks a little bit not that exciting, and possibly a bit ugly.
But I think that's the whole point, is that like imperative shell functional core. It's that, you know, the engine part's always going to look nice, and then the imperative stuff on the outside, which is why when you have that example that I mentioned before, like the guessing game or whatever, it's just like, well, that's like, there is no logic there. It's like the logic is a less than or greater than sign or whatever. Then everything else is just, you know, reading in and outputting. But like a game like Tetris, yeah, there'd probably be a lot of noise, but still, like,
right,
writing the code.
Yeah, the bit in the middle will literally be like a couple of lines that tells if there's a line completed or not.
But that's the nature of the paradigm, isn't it? Because an array language programmer is going to get most interested in that little bit in the middle, because it sort of breaks the whole thing down. That's why I think it's attractive to people who are into mathematics, because you're taking a complex problem with all these layers on top of it, distilling it down to this one little thing, saying, holy smokes, it all boils down to this. And then at that point, the array programmer goes, oh, did it? Oh, and then they get, oh, but by the way, now you have to spend all this time building an interface to make it look flashy. And they're going, yeah, that's not what I'm into, sorry. And because
I would be interested.
Yeah, but I think that is the nature of array programming, is that you tend to get focused on this core stuff that's really conceptually really interesting. And it is a really challenging, and it has this sort of magnet attraction. But I think we do have to come up with ways to make that interaction back to the rest of the world a little easier for us to write, and also make an allowance. I've heard stories about the big problem with our, you know, modern civilization is all engineers want to invent new things. Very few want to maintain anything. And there's not a lot of sexiness in maintenance. You're just working at making something go on working. But it's really important. I think you have to start to draw back into that, say, you know, that mindset that says, you know what, I've got this new thing, that's really cool. But what's also really important is I provide a structure around it. I provide this around it. And I'm basically making something to make it more accessible to everybody, not just that little core at the middle that to me is so attractive.
Rodrigo?
Yeah, I was listening to you folks, and I was thinking about the fact that I'm currently trying to build a Python introductory course, and it's aimed at kids. And so I'm very interested in having those flashy examples, because of it's rewarding to me as it's rewarding to me. I'm not exactly a kid anymore, but it's rewarding to get flashy things working. So it's obviously rewarding to a team. But I think that there are two things at play here. And one is that if I'm going to make, say, a game in Python, there are plenty of libraries. Yeah, fine, that's great. But then I will end up teaching the library to those kids and not Python, right? So what I'll teach them to do is make a bunch of function calls. So I'm not really teaching them programming, or I'm not teaching them Python, I'm just teaching them the framework. But then there's one other thing, and that is the framework looks a lot like Python. And in APL, if you have whatever tool to do whatever, maybe we're talking about Sharpleaf and Sharplot, maybe you want to make some plots, and the code for the plots looks very different from that core that Bob was talking about, the core that we really want to get down to the problem and really solve the problem and write that code. And this is very subjective, but that code will have a certain look and feel to it. And then adding the shell that makes it flashy and presentable to the rest of the world looks very different. And I was thinking that that particular aspect of it might have an impact in us maybe not wanting to spend that much time maybe creating those tools, or I don't know, because it just looks different from the rest of the language.
Yeah, one thing I've got on my gets further and further down my to-do list as time goes on, but last year in March when we had our sort of Appleseed meeting targeting new users, and Thomas Gustafsson, the Stormwind boat simulator guy, came and he presented, he's doing graphics in raw APL, except he has a bit of middleware that's sort of Windows specific for when it actually has to draw it to the screen. But I want to take that and maybe just stick it in. Maybe I know there's JavaScript libraries that will do the drawing to the screen bit, but then maybe you can work towards something that's a bit closer to that, where even the bit that turns it flashy is actually raw APL that looks, and they can be used to teach APL itself rather than just. What I've done in the past is, I guess I did that for one thing where I computed the locations of some points that were going to be drawn up, but then I just passed those points to another thing that turned them into balls. But I guess what you want is the APL to do the creation of the balls and everything up to the point where it has to go on a screen, which, you can either, at some point you're using some kind of library to talk to graphics drivers, but anyway, I think that would be quite a good example if anyone else wants to do it. It's got time.
For procedural languages, I always think of Scratch, which was the MIT project, which is, basically drag and drop for the different for loops or all the different things. And it's very media driven. So in other words, there's lots of things you can do with your audio and your video, and you can make games with it. And there's a sort of a community thing where they work off of you and show what you've done. To me, that's probably the way to do. You've created a shell that teaches your concepts as opposed to trying to teach your concepts within the language. Because coming out of something like Scratch, I think you understand procedural stuff pretty well. And then you can go back into a language and you've sort of learned the paradigm. Recently at the last week's JWiki, I think it was Art Anger said to me, we talked a bit about Scratch as an entry point, something like that. He says, why couldn't you do Scratch for J or Scratch for APL? And I said, it's funny. I thought of that at one point, and I've never really developed it. And I'm sort of feeling the same way.
I think Adam actually made a thing at one point that was sort of a visual drag and drop plugs, and it was you got a primitive symbol and it had 2 slots if it was dyadic. He did start on that, but
But having said that, what do you do beyond your dyadic? I think the thing with the for loop is you can drop something in there and there's only integers fit in that. And then, you've got these different types. With APL or with J, okay, so you've got monadic and you've got dyadic. Okay, you've got operators and you've got verbs, or, conjunctions, adverbs, and verbs. Okay. And then past that, everything can fit onto each other. That's the magic of it. But you don't have that this only fits here sort of thing, which is what you're kind of teaching with Scratch in a procedural language. So the power of the language is you can fit all these things together. That makes it hard to do that way because you can fit all these things together. So it's like throwing a bunch of Legos out on the table and saying, okay, make something with it. Well, this could fit here, it could fit here, it could fit here. Yeah, the idea is you think about where it could fit, but that's what you're actually trying to teach, not so much by physical connection, how they go together, because they all fit together. But why would you do it this way? And that's a different kind of again, I think you're dealing with a different paradigm, so it does take a different approach. You're trying to abstract that paradigm that you're teaching, not the syntactic sugar that goes with it.
Yeah, we go back to what would Aaron do? Because he had this one talk about, does APL need ADTs? And he's like, no, everything's arrays, but you use the arrays to do the representation. That's where part of the imagination comes in. So you have to come up with the representation of the thing you're trying to do as an array, and then APL lets you do all of the manipulation and the shuffling and stuff. But maybe something about visualizing different things represented in arrays. I don't know. This can't go anywhere from this discussion. I'm not developing this right now, but it's interesting.
Well, somebody might. Somebody might take it and run with it, and that would be really interesting to see where they go.
It's interesting what Rodrigo said earlier about the libraries not looking like the language, because that's actually there's a very famous talk by Guy Steele, one of the creators of Scheme, Lisp dialect, and that talk's called Growing a Language, which it comes in paper form as well. And in that talk, he mentions APL and says that he thinks the key reason that APL wasn't successful was exactly what Rodrigo mentioned. It's that a user, when they write APL, it doesn't look like the language. Their library, or if they create a library or whatever they're creating, you have no way. I mean, I know that there are implementations of APLs that enable you to define your own new Unicode symbols, but obviously it's a non-starter in terms of a scalability kind of thing. You're not gonna want to do that at scale. But he mentions that it's the fact that when you write your own code, it looks wildly different than the core language of APL. And I don't know if I agree or disagree, but it's just interesting that you commented on that, Rodrigo, with respect to sort of teaching beginners. And if you're going to focus on some library, sure, maybe in a language like Python, it's not the end of the world because it does sort of look like it still is Python. And sure, you have to teach them a framework, but at least it still looks like the language that you intended to teach them. Whereas with APL, if you're going to teach them, whatever it is, the two different, what was it, sharp plot and sharp leaf, or quad WC for the that stuff's going to end up looking, at least to a certain extent, different than your classic examples that don't have anything to do with plotting or graphics.
But J kind of works against that, because what I write in J looks exactly like, I mean, not the DLLs that are the calls for the primitives, because that goes off to C. But other than the fact that I've got a primitive to start with, the things I'm writing look exactly like the other parts of the structure of the language, the Z locale, all the utilities that are around. When you dive into them, if they're not going to a DLL, they are written exactly the same type of language that I would write if I was writing my own verbs.
I mean, not to bring his ghost in here, but that is, I think, largely Aaron's reason for structuring codefins the way he does. He leans heavily into trains. He uses one-letter variable names, and it's partially so that the end code, I think, you can see it. That really looks like APL. You see a lot of systems-heavy APL stuff, and it's heavy on the control structures and big imperative-style loops, and even literal calls to .NET things that make it look like C# code, So maybe that is a part worth exploring. Whether it will be the key to APL's longevity, who the hell knows? I don't know.
Well, I think I'm not actually sure when we started recording, but I feel like we're past the hour mark here, and
it's been 35 minutes already.
And we've covered a breadth of topics from Rodrigo's beginnings and Python to APL to Wordle to Aaron, like several times.
I just like to highlight that Connor has a Scrabble dictionary just lying around in his computer, always at hand.
I mean, as one does. It's also on my GitHub for those that you go to my GitHub page and look for the Scrabble repo if you'd like it. I think it's 4th edition, not 5th edition, so don't at me. And for Scrabble people, they'll know what that means. It's a frustrating day. There's a story. A frustrating day when you're playing Scrabble and someone plays a 2-letter word, DA, and you're like, that's not a word. And then you go to scrabbledictionary.com and you lose that challenge because the 5th edition is now out and they've added. And does your opponent know that? They do not. No, they're just guessing. And you know what's up. They don't. And anyways, we're not going to talk about it.
Well, no, let's dive into that. What is da?
Well, actually, that'll be a good closing note here. Bear with me.
It works in Portuguese, but I'm assuming the Scrabble dictionary is English.
Da. Play along, listener. I have the definition now. I'll give you a couple seconds to think what you think it means. And the definition is a single word, and it is dad.
No.
Oh, right. Fair enough.
Another 2-letter word that was added in the 5th edition was OM, O-M, which is a mantra used in contemplation of ultimate reality. Yes. All right, this episode fully gone off the rails.
One thing I will say, I was talking before about generational. I have a tremendous amount of hope going forward. When Richard, I think, was saying, so it depends where we go from here, and hopefully it's in good hands. It's in good hands. The newer generation that I see coming on, people using the language, I'm just terrifically impressed with a number of things. One of which, they're super bright. I did I guess I sat in with Remy Clark on the Discord, and he was in Japan. I was in West Coast of North America, and I didn't realize he was in Japan. But the point was, he's going through all this stuff that he's doing with Jay, and I'm just going, wow, and he comes up with this really interesting invisible modifier that just blew me away. Well, I realized at that point, there's no problem with people coming up with new things or the new generation discovering new things. They're absolutely automatically doing that. But the second thing, and I think is really important to the whole community, is I still see that same sense of community supporting each other in these languages, which doesn't always happen in other languages. And sometimes it's been the downfall of some very useful languages. The culture, I find, is really supportive and tends to help, tends to teach more than it is trying to show off, which I think is, everybody's going to have different, everybody wants to show a little bit. But the point is mostly, if you go into any of these groups and ask a question, you're not going to get flamed. You're going to get some really interesting answers, and usually very useful, and quite often step by step how to do something, because everybody knows these languages are hard to change your concepts at the beginning. Everybody's been there. So as a result, I think that makes the community really supportive. And I have lots of faith in the future of these languages, just because I see those two things happening. Really bright people being helpful to each other. That's the core.
That's a perfect way to end it on that hopeful note. Yeah. Any other last things? I guess, Bob, you've got the array, contact at array, something. I should know, but I don't.
contact@arraycast.com. Yeah, that's how to get in touch with us. Actually, there was a really interesting idea somebody came up with that I think we're going to probably do in a future show, and it had to do with control flow and those kind of things. So definitely, if you suggest ideas, if you should suggest guests, last 2 weeks ago, Aaron Chu was the guest, and Aaron was suggested. We wanted Aaron on anyway, but there was a number of suggestions and a number of responses, people saying they were really happy to see him on. So that's a way to get in touch with us. The show notes are important. The transcript, the big thing, my big effect by Rodrigo is the transcript is done most episodes by Rodrigo. He does that and fires it over to me so I don't have to, and that's a huge job. And I just want to say, really appreciative of the work that you do on that. And he's got his hand up, so he's going to say something now.
Just to defend myself, actually, most of the transcript is automatically generated. I just try to I just spend an insurmountable amount of hours putting the sentences together. But thank you, Bob.
But yeah, a couple of times I've had to work from that machine code generated transcript, and that's still hours and hours of reformatting and laughing at all the misspellings, because sometimes those are hilarious. But yeah, it's a tremendous amount of work, and it happens every time. And I think it benefits everybody, because you can always go to the episode and read it. And good for you. Thank you for doing that.
Yeah, huge thanks to Rodrigo, not just for that, but also for coming on and being our guest today. As I mentioned before, yeah, links to all of Rodrigo's content in the form of his YouTube channel, talks that aren't on his YouTube channel, but that he's given at other conferences, his blog, your book, also too. Is there other content that I'm missing that we want to plug right now? Because I know you've got...
I think that's plenty. I think that's plenty.
All right, so yeah. And potentially there's going to be a Python course that's coming out in the future as well. So stay tuned for that in the future at some undefined date.
And I just want to say about Rodrigo's videos, the thing that amazes me about them is he goes in cold with a with a problem and then solves it live, which I've never had the guts to do. When I do a video, I figured it out ahead of time. He doesn't. And occasionally he backs up and starts again, but I think that's just so impressive. And actually, I think that shows the power of array languages as much as anything else, that you can be that flexible and change and go back and forth and come up with these answers. So his videos are really worth checking out.
Especially if you like LeetCode, because a lot of his most recent videos, honestly, I love them because they're short, and I usually end up learning at least one or two things from each one. I think Rich, you actually, we plugged Rich's channel as well. Rickety P also used to, I mean, not as much. Yeah, not as much recently, but you used to also solve like LeetCode or Perl Weekly Challenge.
Yeah, I haven't made content in a while. Yeah, should get back on it.
Yeah, two different. And Bob, we'll plug your YouTube channel too, and mine. We're plugging. I guess all four of us have YouTube channels. Check the show notes, and you can start with Rodrigo's channel, and if you get through all of his videos, you can work our way to the rest of ours. But with that, I think we'll say happy array programming.
Happy array programming.